Sophie Bennett never imagined that a simple walk through town would change her life forever. It was a gray autumn afternoon, and the cold wind blew through the narrow streets of Seabrook, a small coastal town known for its old stories and buried secrets. Sophie wandered aimlessly, trying to escape the weight of her own thoughts. Ever since she had given up on writing her novel months ago, she felt as though something essential had been ripped out of her. The creativity that once flowed so naturally now seemed lost, like a boat adrift in a stormy sea. It was then that she saw the bookstore, or more precisely, what was left of it. The old shop had been abandoned for years, its windows covered with boards and the paint peeling off to reveal the bare wood underneath. A rusty sign swayed in the wind, the words, "Marlowe's Books," almost illegible. Something about that decrepit facade caught her attention. There was a melancholy there that echoed the feeling Sophie had been carrying with her. Without much thought, she pushed the creaky door open and stepped inside. The interior of the bookstore was like a time capsule. Crooked shelves held piles of forgotten books, covered by a thin layer of dust. The air smelled of old paper and rotting wood, but there was something magical about the place. Sophie ran her fingers over the rough spines of the books, feeling their coarse texture. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, perhaps inspiration, or maybe just a distraction. But then, something caught her eye. In a shelf almost hidden in the darkest corner of the store, there was a book different from the others. Its brown leather cover was worn, but it still retained a certain charm. Sophie carefully pulled it out and began flipping through the yellowed pages. In the middle of the book, something fell to the floor with a soft sound. It was a folded letter, written by hand in elegant handwriting. She crouched down to pick it up, feeling the weight of that piece of paper between her fingers. The letter seemed old, as if it had been kept there for decades. With a racing heart, Sophie unfolded it and began to read. "To Thomas, wherever you are, if this letter ever reaches your hands, know that my heart still belongs to you. The treasure we promised to guard together still waits for us. I don't know if I'll ever see you again, but I hope that somehow you can feel the echo of my love through time. With all my heart, Eleanor." Sophie held her breath. Who were Eleanor, Hart, and Thomas? What did this treasure mean? And why was the letter hidden there, among the pages of a forgotten book? Each sentence seemed like an invitation to dive into a world of mysteries. She looked around as if expecting someone to appear and explain it all. But the bookstore was empty, except for her and the oppressive silence. Carefully tucking the letter into her pocket, Sophie decided she needed to find out more. She didn't know why, but she felt as though the letter had fallen into her hands, for a reason. It was as if Eleanor were whispering through the years, asking for her story to be told. As she left the bookstore, the cold wind seemed stronger, but Sophie barely noticed. Her mind was filled with questions. Who was Eleanor Hart, and who was Thomas? What happened to them? And most importantly, what did this treasure mentioned in the letter mean? While walking back home, Sophie realized that something inside her had changed. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of curiosity and purpose. That letter was more than just an old piece of paper. It was a door to the past, a chance to explore a story that seemed to have been buried by time. And Sophie was determined to uncover every detail, but she had no idea that this journey would take her far beyond what she could ever imagine. The next day, Sophie woke up with the letter still on her mind. Eleanor's words echoed like a riddle she needed to solve. After a nearly sleepless night, she decided to visit the town's historical archive, a place where, perhaps, she could find clues about who Eleanor Hart and Thomas Reed were. She knew it was a long shot, but something inside her urged her to follow this intuition. The historical archive was located in an old building in the center of Seabrook, with tall windows and intricately carved wooden doors. Upon entering, Sophie was greeted by a reverent silence, interrupted only by the soft sound of pages being turned and muffled footsteps on the wooden floor. She approached the main counter, where an elderly woman with round glasses was organizing documents. "Hello?" Sophie began hesitantly. "I'm trying to find out more about two people who lived here during World War II. Their names are Eleanor Hart and Thomas Reed." The woman frowned thoughtfully. "Eleanor Hart. The name sounds familiar, but I'm not sure. Maybe you should talk to Noah Carter. He's a historian and knows a lot about local history. He's here today, in the archive room." Sophie felt a chill in her stomach. "Thank you," she murmured, following the woman's instructions. When she reached the indicated room, she found a man leaning over a table covered with papers and old photographs. He wore a worn brown coat and had a focused expression, as if completely immersed in what he was doing. It was Noah Carter. "Excuse me," Sophie said timidly. "Are you Noah Carter?" He looked up, surprised to be interrupted. His face was marked by strong features, but his eyes held a kindness that disarmed her. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" Sophie hesitated for a moment before pulling the letter from her pocket. "I found this yesterday in an abandoned bookstore. I think it might be important, but I don't know where to start." She handed him the letter, watching as he read it carefully. Noah's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the name. "Eleanor Hart? Yes, I've heard that name before. There are some records about her in the town archives, but I've never found many details. Who is Thomas Reed?" He looked at Sophie, curious. "I have no idea," Sophie admitted. "But it seems they had some kind of special connection. And there's this mention of a treasure. I thought you might know more." Noah smiled faintly, intrigued. "Well, that's certainly interesting. I'm not sure we can call it treasure, but it's definitely worth investigating. I'd love to help." Sophie felt immediate relief. "Really? That would be amazing." In the days that followed, Sophie and Noah began working together, sifting through old documents and maps of the town. Noah had an impressive knowledge of local history, and Sophie admired how he could connect small details that seemed unrelated. They spent hours buried in the archives, discussing theories and exchanging ideas. Beyond the work, Sophie noticed there was something captivating about Noah. He was reserved, but he had a subtle sense of humor that made her smile at unexpected moments. They shared long conversations about their lives. Sophie talked about her frustration with writing, and Noah mentioned his love for history and his passion for preserving memories of the past. One day, while examining an old map of the town, Noah pointed to an isolated house by the sea. "This property belonged to the Hart family," he explained. "Maybe it's worth taking a look. There might be something that can help us understand Eleanor better." Sophie felt a shiver of excitement. "Let's go then," she said, determined. On the way to the house, Sophie and Noah talked about their own lives. Noah revealed that he had lost someone important years ago, a loss he still carried with him. Sophie, in turn, confessed that she had given up writing because she felt her stories didn't matter to anyone. "You know," Noah said, looking at her, "sometimes the best stories are the ones we find when we least expect them. Maybe this letter is your new inspiration." Sophie smiled, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. When they arrived at the abandoned house, the atmosphere changed. The place seemed haunted by old memories, with broken windows and walls covered in ivy. But Sophie and Noah knew that there might be a key to unraveling the mystery of Eleanor and Thomas inside. "Let's see what we can find," Noah said, turning on his flashlight. Sophie nodded, feeling the weight of expectation. They were about to discover something that would change everything. The house by the sea looked like something out of a Gothic tale. Its wooden walls were covered in layers of ivy, as if nature were trying to reclaim what was left of the structure. The broken windows reflected the gray sky, and the sound of waves echoed in the background, creating a melancholic and slightly eerie atmosphere. Sophie felt a shiver as she pushed open the rusty gate, but something inside her insisted she keep going. "Are you sure you want to go in?" Noah asked, looking at her with a mix of concern and curiosity. "No," Sophie admitted with a nervous smile, "but I'm also sure we need to find out what's here." They walked up to the main entrance, where the door was slightly ajar, creaking softly with the wind. Noah illuminated the way with his flashlight as they cautiously stepped into the dark, dusty interior. The air smelled of mold and abandonment, but there was something more, a feeling that this place still held secrets. "Let's start with the main rooms," Noah suggested. "If this house belonged to the Hart family, maybe we'll find something related to Eleanor." Sophie agreed, and they began exploring the rooms one by one. The living room was practically empty, except for some furniture covered with dusty sheets. In the kitchen, old shelves still held broken jars and rusted utensils. But it was in a hidden room at the end of the hallway that they found something truly intriguing. In a built-in cabinet on the wall, there was an old wooden box, carved with symbols that seemed handwritten. At first glance, it looked like just another antique piece of furniture. But when Sophie touched the door, she realized there was something different about it. It was locked, but not with an ordinary lock. It was an old-fashioned, almost artisanal lock. "This is strange," Sophie commented, examining the door. "Why would someone lock a cabinet like this?" Noah frowned. "Maybe it's exactly what we're looking for." Carefully, he used a small tool he always carried with him to open old locks. After a few tense minutes, they heard a soft click. The door opened slowly, revealing a wooden box with hand-carved symbols. "This box looks very old," Sophie murmured, carefully picking it up. She placed it on a nearby table and opened it slowly. Inside, they found a leather-bound diary and some faded photographs. The photos showed two smiling people, a young woman and a man in military uniform. They were close, their expressions radiating genuine happiness. On the back of one of the photos, there was an inscription: "Eleanor and Thomas, summer of 1943. Sophie felt a lump in her throat. This was proof that Eleanor and Thomas had really existed, and that their love had been real. She flipped through the diary, finding pages filled with elegant handwriting. Some phrases jumped out at her. "Today, Thomas promised he would come back to me. He said our love would be eternal, even if the world tried to separate us. I've hidden our treasure where no one will ever find it. One day he'll return to claim it." "This is getting more mysterious by the minute," Noah said, observing the notes. "What did she mean by treasure?" Sophie shook her head thoughtfully. "I don't know, but it seems we're on the right track. We need to keep investigating." "Hurry." They organized the clues found in the box. Sophie felt as though they were being watched. She glanced out at the broken window, but saw nothing except the wind stirring the trees. Still, the feeling persisted. "Do you feel that?" Sophie asked Noah. He nodded seriously. "Yes, we're not alone here." Before they could discuss it further, they heard a distant sound, footsteps on the floor below. Sophie and Noah exchanged a tense look. "Who's there?" Noah called out, trying to sound confident. A hooded figure appeared at the entrance of the house, partially hidden by the shadows. His voice was hoarse and tense. "You shouldn't be here. This isn't something that should be uncovered." "Who are you?" Sophie whispered. The figure hesitated, then raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm a descendant of Thomas Reed. This story belongs to my family. You can't just dig up the past without understanding the consequences." Sophie and Noah exchanged another glance. They knew they had found something much bigger than they had imagined. "We can help," Sophie finally said. "This story deserves to be told, not to expose your pain, but to celebrate the love they shared." The hooded figure hesitated again, then lowered his hood, revealing a face marked by time and worry. "Maybe you're right, but be prepared. What you're about to discover will change everything." That night, Sophie could barely sleep. The images of Eleanor and Thomas's photographs danced in her mind, along with the unsettling feeling that someone had been watching them at the abandoned house. She couldn't shake the idea that there was someone, or something, trying to stop them from unraveling the mystery. The next morning, she met Noah at a quiet cafe near the historical archive. He was already there, sitting at a corner table, with steaming cups of coffee waiting. Sophie sat down, noticing the thoughtful expression on his face. "You couldn't sleep either?" she asked, trying to lighten the tension. Noah shook his head. "No. Those footsteps, that feeling of being watched. It wasn't our imagination, Sophie. Someone knows what we're doing." Sophie sighed, feeling the weight of the situation. But who? And why would anyone care so much about this after all these years? Noah frowned, reflecting. Maybe it's someone connected to the Hart family, or maybe someone is protecting the treasure mentioned in the diary. Whatever it is, it's valuable enough to draw attention. They opened the diary again, analyzing every detail. Between the pages, they found a hand-drawn map with marks and notes that seemed to indicate specific locations in the town. One of the highlighted points was an old boat anchored at the harbor, identified only as Hart's Legacy. "This must be our next destination," Noah said, pointing to the map. "If this boat belonged to the Hart family, there might be more clues there." Sophie agreed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into dangerous waters, literally and figuratively. Still, she knew they couldn't give up now. When they arrived at the harbor, the boat was exactly where the map indicated. It was an old vessel, with weathered wooden planks and rusty rigging. It looked abandoned for decades, but there was something peculiar about its appearance, as if someone had tried to preserve it, even minimally. "Let's be careful," Noah warned, illuminating the way with his flashlight. They boarded the ship cautiously, feeling the floor creak under their feet. The interior of the boat was dark and full of closed compartments. Sophie began searching through drawers and cabinets, while Noah examined the deck. It was Sophie who found something significant. In a locked drawer, she discovered a sealed envelope with the name Thomas written on the front. Inside, there was a letter that seemed to be a response to the one Eleanor had written. "My dearest Eleanor, I received your letter, but I don't know if I'll ever be able to return for it. War is consuming me, and each day feels harder than the last. But know that your love is my only light in this darkness. If I don't survive, I promise that our treasure will remain safe, a symbol of what we shared. May it find its way back to you even if I cannot." Sophie felt tears welling up in her eyes. This letter was proof of the deep love between Eleanor and Thomas, but it also suggested that something terrible had happened to him. "This changes everything," Noah said, reading over her shoulder. "The treasure isn't material, it's emotional. It's their love, preserved through time." But before they could reflect further, they heard a sound coming from the dock. Heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden planks, approaching quickly. Sophie and Noah exchanged an alarmed look. "Who's there?" Noah shouted, trying to sound confident. A hooded figure appeared at the entrance of the boat, partially hidden by the shadows. His voice was hoarse and tense. "You shouldn't be here. This isn't something that should be uncovered." "Who are you?" Sophie asked, trying to stay calm. The figure hesitated, then lowered his hood, revealing a face marked by time and worry. "I'm a descendant of Thomas Reed. This story belongs to my family. You can't just dig up the past without understanding the consequences." Sophie and Noah exchanged another glance. They knew they had stumbled upon something far bigger than they had imagined. "We can help," Sophie finally said. "This story deserves to be told. Not to expose your pain, but to celebrate the love they shared." The figure hesitated again, then nodded. "Perhaps you're right. But be prepared. What you're about to discover will change everything." After the tense encounter with Thomas Reed's descendant on the boat, Sophie and Noah decided they needed to continue their search, now more determined than ever. The man had agreed to let them proceed, but warned that the lighthouse mentioned in the records was a dangerous place, both because of its isolation and the secrets it held. He also handed them one last document, a letter written by Eleanor shortly before her death, which contained details about the treasure and its emotional significance. "This is much more than I expected," Sophie said as she examined the letter, under the dim light of a lamp in Noah's car. Eleanor wrote this as if she knew someone someday would find her words. Noah nodded, driving carefully along the dark coastal roads. She was trusting the future. Maybe she chose you to tell this story, Sophie. Sophie felt a shiver at the thought. The idea that Eleanor, in some way, had guided her journey was both unsettling and comforting. She looked out the window, watching the violent waves crash against the rocks. The lighthouse stood on an isolated cliff, accessible only by a narrow, winding trail. It was a place that seemed straight out of a dream or a nightmare. "Have you ever been there?" Sophie asked, trying to break the heavy silence inside the car. "Once when I was a child," Noah replied. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the lighthouse. They said it was used as a meeting point for lovers during the war. But there were also rumors that something terrible happened there, something no one wanted to talk about openly." Sophie frowned. What could have happened? Noah hesitated before answering. "I don't know for sure, but I think we're about to find out." The journey to the lighthouse was long and silent, except for the constant sound of the waves and the wind battering the car. Sophie took the moment to reflect on everything that had happened so far. Since finding the first letter in the abandoned bookstore, her life had changed drastically. She had not only rediscovered her passion for storytelling, but had also begun to see Noah in a different light. There was something about him, his dedication, his kindness, his insatiable curiosity, that made her feel something she thought she had lost long ago. "You're deep in thought," Noah commented, interrupting her thoughts. Sophie smiled faintly. "I'm just trying to understand all of this. It feels like every clue we find leads us to something bigger. And somehow it feels like this story. It chose us." Noah glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "Maybe it did. Or maybe it's just coincidence. But one thing is certain. This search is changing us. At least it's changing me." Sophie felt warmth rise to her face. She wanted to say something, but the words got stuck in her throat. Instead, she returned to looking out the window, watching the lighthouse slowly emerge on the horizon. Its dark silhouette stood out against the night sky, illuminated only by the distant glow of its lantern. When they reached the cliff, the wind was even stronger, whipping their hair and clothes. Sophie and Noah walked up to the entrance of the lighthouse, where a heavy wooden door blocked access. Noah used his tool to unlock it, and they cautiously stepped inside. The interior of the lighthouse was dark and damp, smelling of salt and dust. A spiral staircase led to the top, where the lantern still worked, casting its light over the restless sea. Sophie felt a chill as she climbed the steps, as if they were being watched by something or someone. "This feeling again," Sophie murmured. Glancing around, Noah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'm here. We're not giving up now." At the top of the lighthouse, they found a small, hidden room behind a false door. Inside, there was a dusty table and an old chest with the name Eleanor engraved on the lid. Sophie and Noah exchanged an expectant look. "This is it," Sophie said, almost breathless. "Eleanor's treasure." But before they could open the chest, they heard footsteps echoing up the stairs. Someone was coming up. The footsteps on the stairs echoed like thunder, each one closer than the last. Sophie and Noah exchanged an alarmed look, frozen for a moment. Whoever was coming up hadn't made any effort to hide their presence. The sound of their own racing hearts seemed to fill the tense silence around them. "Who's there?" Noah called out, trying to sound firm as he positioned his body protectively in front of Sophie. A familiar but still urgent voice responded. "It's me," said Thomas Reed's descendant, appearing at the top of the stairs with his hood down. His face was pale, illuminated only faintly by the dim light coming through the window. "I had to come. I couldn't let you uncover this alone." Sophie felt a mix of relief and apprehension. "Why did you follow us here?" The man hesitated before answering, his eyes fixed on the old chest on the table. "Because this treasure, it's not just a symbol of Eleanor and Thomas's love. It's something my family has protected for decades, something that could change everything." Noah frowned, stepping closer to the chest. "Then help us understand. What's inside it?" The man hesitated again, as if fighting against himself. Finally, he nodded. "You have the right to know, but be prepared." Carefully, Noah opened the lid of the chest. Inside, there was a silver locket containing a faded photograph of Eleanor and Thomas, side by side, smiling as if the entire world belonged to them. In addition, there were letters tied together with a worn ribbon, each one handwritten with words overflowing with love and hope. Sophie picked up one of the letters and began reading aloud. "My dear Thomas, I know fate may separate us, but know that my heart will always be with you. This locket contains our promise, a reminder that even in darkness, our love will be an eternal light." Sophie felt tears welling up in her eyes. It was impossible not to be moved by the depth of the love Eleanor and Thomas shared. But there was something else in the chest, a small leather notebook filled with sketches and notes. It appeared to be Eleanor's personal diary, detailing her memories and reflections during the years she was separated from Thomas. "This is incredible," Sophie murmured, carefully flipping through the pages. "These words, they're so powerful. It's as if she's speaking directly to us." Thomas's descendant observed everything in silence, his eyes shining with a mix of sadness and pride. "My family always knew these memories were precious, but we also knew that someday, someone would need to tell this story. Maybe that someone is you, Sophie." She looked at him, surprised. "Me?" "Yes," he replied. "You found the letter, you followed the clues, and now you have the chance to give voice to Eleanor and Thomas. Just promise me you'll do it with respect and with love." Noah placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, offering silent support. She nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility grow inside her. "I'll do it. I promise." But before they could leave the lighthouse, the man handed them one last document, a letter written by Thomas shortly before his death in the war. The words were simple, but heavy with emotion. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I didn't survive. But know that my love for you never died. Our treasure, our memories, our promises will live on as long as someone remembers us. Guard it as I guarded our love." Sophie felt a lump in her throat. That letter was a farewell, but also a celebration of the love that transcended time and death. She looked at Noah, realizing that this journey had not only changed her perspective on the past, but also on the present and on the future. "It's time to go," Noah said softly, interrupting her thoughts. They left the lighthouse in silence, carrying with them not only the objects they had found, but also the sense that something greater awaited them. Sophie knew that this story wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. Back in town, Sophie and Noah walked side by side through the quiet streets of Seabrook, still absorbing the weight of the revelations at the lighthouse. The cold wind blew softly, but neither of them seemed to notice. Their minds were filled with images of Eleanor and Thomas, their smiles, their letters, their eternal promise. It was as if the love between the two had traveled through decades to touch their own lives. "It's strange," Sophie said finally, breaking the silence. I always thought love stories like this only existed in books. But now, I see that they're real. That love can survive anything. Noah nodded, looking at her with a faint smile. Eleanor and Thomas proved that. Even separated by war and time, they never stopped believing in each other. It's something rare these days. Sophie felt a pang of sadness as she thought about her own life. Since giving up on writing, she had closed herself off from the world, and from love. But now, standing beside Noah, something inside her was beginning to change. He had been her anchor throughout this entire journey, offering support, patience, and understanding. And, without her realizing it, he had awakened something in her that she thought was lost forever. We're building something special too, aren't we? Sophie asked hesitantly, looking at him. Noah stopped walking, surprised by the question. He looked at her for a moment before responding, his voice soft but full of sincerity. Yes, we are. This journey hasn't just brought us closer to the past, but it's also brought out something I didn't expect to find. A connection with you? Sophie felt her heart race. She knew she was developing feelings for Noah, but hearing it said aloud felt different. It was as if all the walls she had built over the years were starting to crumble. I feel it too, she admitted, lowering her eyes for a moment before meeting his gaze again. But I'm scared, Noah. Scared of giving myself completely and then losing everything again. Noah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, forcing her to look at him. We can't control the future, Sophie, but we can choose to live in the present. Eleanor and Thomas showed us that. They didn't know what fate held for them, but they still chose to love with everything they had. His words touched something deep inside her. Sophie realized she had spent so much time trapped in the past, in disappointments, in losses, that she had forgotten how to live in the moment. Maybe it was time to change that. You're right, she said with a hesitant smile. Maybe it's time for me to stop running and start living again. Noah smiled back, his eyes shining with something Sophie couldn't fully identify. Perhaps. Hope. Perhaps something more. Then let's do it together. They continued walking, now with a new lightness in the air. Sophie knew there was still much to resolve, both regarding Eleanor and Thomas's story and her own feelings. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. Later that night, Sophie sat at the table in her small house, surrounded by the items found in the lighthouse. The locket, the letters, and Eleanor's diary were laid out in front of her, like pieces of a puzzle that finally made sense. She picked up a pen and began to write, her words flowing naturally for the first time in months. There are stories that echo through time, connecting generations and hearts. This is one of them. As she wrote, Sophie realized she wasn't just telling Eleanor and Thomas's story. She was rediscovering her own voice. And somehow she knew this journey wasn't ending with the last period. It was just the beginning. The following days were a mix of nostalgia and renewal for Sophie. She spent hours sitting at her desk, transforming Eleanor and Thomas's memories into words. Every letter, every photograph, every detail from the diary found in the lighthouse came to life in her manuscript. It was as if Eleanor were whispering stories from the past, while Sophie wove them into something new. But it wasn't just Eleanor and Thomas's story that was taking shape. It was also her own. The search for the treasure had changed Sophie in ways she never imagined. She had rediscovered her passion for writing, but, more importantly, she had begun to see the world and people in a new light. And at the center of this change was Noah. From the beginning, he had been more than just a companion in the investigation. He was her anchor, her source of support and inspiration. Sophie realized that without him, she might never have found the courage to face her own fears and blockages. Now, every time she looked at him, she felt something growing inside her, something she no longer wanted to ignore. One afternoon, while working on the manuscript, Sophie decided to take a break and walk to the beach. The sound of the waves always helped her think, and she needed a moment to organize her thoughts. When she arrived, she found Noah sitting on a wooden bench, gazing at the horizon. He seemed lost in thought, but smiled when he saw her approach. "Waiting for me?" Sophie asked, sitting beside him. "Actually, I was thinking about everything that's happened," Noah replied, looking at her. "This journey, it's changed you, hasn't it?" Sophie nodded, feeling a gentle breeze tousle her hair. "It's changed both of us. I don't know what I would have done without you, Noah. You helped me find something I thought I'd lost forever." "My voice." Noah smiled, but there was seriousness in his eyes. "And you helped me remember that love can survive anything. Eleanor. And Thomas showed us that. But it was you who made me believe again." Sophie felt a tightening in her chest. She knew Noah carried his own scars, just like she did. But together, they were beginning to heal them. "What are we going to do now?" Sophie asked hesitantly. "I mean, after I finish the book?" Noah looked out at the sea for a moment before answering. "I think that depends on us. We can keep building something together, Sophie, not just as friends but as partners, if you want to." Sophie felt her heart race. It was exactly what she wanted, but hearing it aloud left her momentarily speechless. Finally, she smiled. "I want to, Noah, more than anything." They slowly leaned toward each other, and for the first time, Sophie allowed herself to feel something she had long avoided: hope. When their lips met in a soft kiss, she knew this was only the beginning of a new story. In the days that followed, Sophie dove back into the manuscript with renewed energy. She wrote about Eleanor and Thomas, about the love that transcended time and war, about the treasure that was never material but emotional, and at the end of the book, she included a special dedication. "To Noah, who helped me find my way back to stories, and to love." When Sophie finished the last paragraph, she felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced in a long time. She knew this book was more than a tribute to Eleanor and Thomas. It was a celebration of everything she had learned along the way. The day of the book launch arrived faster than Sophie had expected. The small bookstore in the center of Seabrook, recently renovated, was packed with curious people eager to learn Eleanor and Thomas's story. Sophie observed everything with a mix of nervousness and pride as people flipped through her book, Echoes of the Lighthouse. It was as if every page carried not only memories of the past, but also the hopes of the present. Noah was by her side, holding her hand discreetly. He knew how much this moment meant to Sophie, not just as a writer, but as someone who had rediscovered her passion and purpose. When their eyes met, Sophie felt a wave of gratitude. Without him, none of this would have been possible. "You ready?" Noah asked, smiling. "Ready," Sophie replied, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." She stepped up to the small makeshift stage in the bookstore, where an attentive audience awaited her words. Sophie adjusted the microphone and looked at the faces before her, friends, neighbors, and even some strangers who had been touched by Eleanor and Thomas's story. "When I found that first letter in an abandoned bookstore," Sophie began, her voice soft but firm, "I never imagined it would lead me on such a transformative journey. Eleanor and Thomas taught me that love can survive anything, even time and distance. But more than that, they showed me that our stories never truly die. They echo through generations, touching lives in ways we don't always understand." Sophie paused, looking at Noah in the crowd. He smiled, encouraging her to continue. "Writing this book was a way to honor Eleanor and Thomas, but it was also a way for me to reconnect with myself. I learned that just like them, all of us leave echoes in our passage through life. Those echoes can be memories, words, or even simple gestures. What matters is that they remain, and that they continue to inspire others." The audience erupted into warm applause, and Sophie felt tears welling up in her eyes. She knew this was only the beginning. Her story with Noah was just starting, just like this new chapter in her life as a writer. After the event, Sophie and Noah walked along the beach at sunset, as they had done so many times before. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the sound of the waves seemed like the perfect melody for the moment. "You know," Sophie said, holding Noah's hand, "this journey isn't ending here. There are so many other stories waiting to be told." Noah smiled, squeezing her hand. "And I'll be by your side for all of them." They stopped for a moment, gazing at the horizon. Sophie felt a deep peace, as if she had finally found her place in the world. She knew that, just like Eleanor and Thomas, she and Noah were building something special, something that would echo through generations. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Sophie realized that the greatest treasures in life aren't material, but rather the connections we create and the stories we share. And in her case, the greatest echo of all was the love she had found with Noah.
Do you love heartwarming love stories that touch your soul? Then subscribe now to our channel, Timeless Love Stories. We post new videos every week, filled with romance, twists, and happy endings that will leave you inspired. Don't miss a single chapter of this magical journey. Click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to be alerted whenever a new video is released. Come experience these unforgettable stories with us.